We all know the dangers. We all know the potential catastrophe. We now have to do something about it.
An understanding of climate change and the science behind it can help open doors. Kids sort of see this as a challenge of the future, and I think it might sort of encourage more kids to get into science, to take on the challenge.
One of the greatest challenges that we face, and our younger generation are going to have to deal with this, finding solutions. I'm an optimist, but I also firmly believe science and technology are at the heart of our solutions.
Hello and welcome to the latest in the Science Museum Group's Global Climate Talk series. I'm Roger Highfield, Director of Science at the Science Museum in London, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's online event. This year has seen a seismic shift in American politics, record high temperatures and more severe weather. As one example, Hurricanes Helene and Milton have caused tens of billions of dollars of destruction and claimed hundreds of lives in America, with analysis showing that global heating makes hurricanes of this magnitude more likely. Given this month's presidential election, tonight's climate talks focus upon America, one of the globe's largest emitters of greenhouse gases. We ask one simple question: what role will America, under its new president, a climate skeptic, play in the global green transition from fossil fuels to renewables? We've assembled a fantastic panel to work out what the end of US leadership in the energy transition might mean. I'm delighted to now hand over to our chair for this evening, an award-winning New York-based science journalist, broadcaster and author, Angela Saini.
Much appreciated, Roger, and welcome to tonight's Climate Talk, everyone. Thank you especially for joining us on the eve of Thanksgiving. The United States, of course, is a nation of great innovation with the capital, the skills, and the people power needed to achieve its previously stated targets of halving greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. But the country does face significant challenges on the path to decarbonising. A poor railway infrastructure means road and air transportation is still heavily relied upon. Many of the country's 144 million homes still need upgrades to become energy efficient, and power grids built to accommodate coal now need an overhaul to be ready for green energy. And last, but certainly not least, we have a president-elect now, Donald Trump, who is a climate skeptic. So, does America have the will to overcome its logistical and political hurdles and lead the rest of the world in a green transition? In tonight's Climate Talk, our experts are going to be discussing America's impact on climate change, both at home and around the world. And before I get started, I should add that I'm a journalist. I'm here in an independent capacity, not as a representative or an employee of the museum. So I do think it would be remiss of me not to remind you that the Science Museum does receive sponsorship from energy companies. And there's a very important debate to be had about the ethics of that. And although that's not directly what we're talking about tonight, it is a wider conversation that we all need to be part of. But for now, let's meet our wonderful panel in no particular order. A warm welcome to Dr. Ellen Stofan, Undersecretary for Science and Research at the Smithsonian, and previously the Director of the National Air and Space Museum and Chief Scientist of NASA. Good evening also to Dr. Leah C. Stokes, Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Senior Policy Consultant at Evergreen Action and Rewiring America, and the host of the Climate Change podcast, A Matter of Degrees. Dr. Stokes has also authored Short-Circuiting Policy Interest Groups and the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. And finally, welcome to Juliet Eilperin, Deputy Climate and Environment Editor at the Washington Post, and a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2019 for a groundbreaking series that showed with scientific clarity the devastating effects of extreme temperatures on the planet. And in case you're wondering why the lineup is a little bit different from that previously advertised, Juliet is a very welcome last-minute replacement for Derek Passarelli, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight. And Juliet, we're going to kick off things with you, if that's okay. So, looking back over the last 4 years, I mean, America is in a remarkable point of flux at the moment. Looking back over the last 4 years, what do you feel have been the biggest successes and areas of progress of the current outgoing administration? And what have been the climate policies that you think have had the biggest impact?
Well, clearly the biggest action we've seen on climate change from the Biden administration is the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a name which is not related to climate change, but of course, initially authorized $369 billion in incentives, subsidies, tax breaks. But at this point, there's a projection that it could reach as high as $1 trillion that will be spent by the US government transforming, our energy system, people's homes, manufacturing, the way we drive, things like that. And so when you look at that, that has sparked a significant change across the United States. We've seen, real changes in terms of some of our manufacturing base focusing on clean energy. In some cases, it's an expansion of already established industries such as solar. In other cases, it's really kickstarting things like battery manufacturing. And one of the interesting things, which is an analysis that, for example, the Washington Post showcased tapping what work done by the Clean Energy Monitor, a collaboration between MIT and the Rhodium Group, is that, for example, when you look at actually just clean energy manufacturing, roughly two-thirds of that money went to congressional districts that are controlled and are significantly Republican. And so you've seen it affect basically, every single state in the union. And really that is one of the kind of actions that will in many ways continue to be sustained. There are certainly policies that are part of that law that could potentially be overturned by the next administration and the next Congress. But in many ways, that has sparked a shift that in some ways will be enduring and translates into actual cuts in greenhouse gas emissions from the United States and ultimately from a wide range of countries who will be buying things that are manufactured here.
Okay, well, it's good to be able to start on a positive note then. At least there's that progress that's been made. And just moving on then to the next administration, the incoming president has picked all his cabinet nominees. The new Secretary of Energy that he's chosen, Chris Wright, is the CEO of a fracking company, Liberty Energy. What do you expect this means for the Department of Energy?
Well, there will be significant changes. To provide some context to this, because I think it's important. Obviously, I first identified what has been a real shift, in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States under the current president. I think it is also worth noting that oil and gas drilling on federal land and in federal waters has hit an all-time high under this administration. And so one of the really interesting things is when you look at what will be different under President Trump as he returns to the White House, is when you talk to some of the smartest analysts, people do not anticipate that there will be a significant change in oil and gas production in the United States. However, and we can talk a little bit about Chris Wright, who's been tapped to head the Energy Department, but also I think it's really important to look at a couple of, at least one other Trump, at this point, pick, which is Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, who has a really interesting role because he has been tapped both to head the Interior Department, which quite frankly does much more on oil and gas production and mineral production than the Department of Energy, but also to chair the National Energy Council, kind of a new group that the Trump transition has identified it will establish within the White House, which will have Chris Wright from Energy and others trying to set policies across the administration in the same way that, for example, President Biden had a domestic climate advisor in the White House who was working on coordinating action across government agencies. So certainly the orientation is going to be profoundly different. It will focus on expanding oil and gas production, much more so than coal production, which is something that Donald Trump talked a lot about in his first term and first campaign, and has not really emphasized this time. So when you look at what's going to happen, with someone like Chris Wright, who is on record saying that there's been an overemphasis on shifting away from fossil fuels, and that in fact they are a really important part of the energy mix in a way that hasn't been emphasized by the current administration, you will see a de-emphasis on a number of climate priorities of this administration. You could see it have ramifications for what kind of scientific funding there is and what kind of programs. Certainly one issue that former President Trump, President-elect Trump, has identified is that he intends to yet again withdraw from the Paris Agreement and play much less of an active role in global climate negotiations like the ones that just wrapped up in Baku, Azerbaijan. So I think there'll certainly be efforts to curtail foreign assistance for other countries when it comes to either starting clean energy projects or coping with the impacts of climate change. So certainly when you have people like Chris Wright or Doug Burgum coming in, they will have different priorities, and they are focused on advancing domestic fossil fuel production. At the same time, there is a significant constituency for a number of these clean energy projects that have flourished in Republican-leaning areas in the South, in the Great Plains, in the Southwest. And so it's not as if instantly everything that's happening right now that's been spurred by the previous administration will disappear, especially because when you want to change federal rules, it takes some time.
Right. Okay. So a mixed picture then. So very quickly before we move on to Leah, I just wanted to ask you about what it's like to be a journalist in this space, because this is coming at the same time that the media is fracturing. The sources that people get their information from, of course, very much diversified. And it means there is a lot of disinformation, not just from marginal sources, not even in mainstream sources, but actually directly from people in power themselves, people with influence. What does that mean for someone like you covering this topic?
Certainly there can be challenges, especially with the level of disinformation that spreads in different areas, including in the wake of disasters such as Hurricane Helene. The flip side that I would say is that one of the things that's very heartening is that we dispatch people across the country, especially when you have some of these disasters, and people are really eager for information and to have stories told. When we were writing about, for example, some of the hardest hit areas from the storm, from Helene as well as Milton, people were so appreciative that we covered what was actually happening. In many cases, it made it easier, relief came more quickly as a result. And so we see that we have an incredibly important role to play. Obviously, things can be polarized, but we're absolutely committed to providing the time and resources and the information that people need in the United States and around the world.
Thanks so much, Juliet. Okay, so let's move to Leah now. Leah, there was a recent episode of your podcast with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, A Matter of Degrees, that touched on the controversial Project 2025 document, which people will know. It's a Heritage Foundation document preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency at a time when we didn't know there was going to be one yet. If the policies outlined in that document really are adopted, and we don't know that they will be, but if they are, how do you think that could impact America's green ambitions then?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be on this panel with all of everybody else. I also want to flag that I'm just doing this as a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I am not affiliated with Evergreen Action anymore, just for everyone's awareness. And also, I want to acknowledge, as was done at the top of the hour, the activists who are, raising questions around the Science Museum having fossil fuel funding, and just, uplift some of the questions that they're asking, which I think are very legitimate. But with that said, yes. So for those who don't know, Project 2025 was a 900-page document written by folks affiliated with the Heritage Foundation that really outlined a plan for a future conservative government like the Trump administration. And although on the campaign trail, President-elect Trump said that he was not affiliated with that, he's already made some appointments to the administration, such as I think the head of OMB, which is a very critical part of the White House, from the Project 2025 team, which shouldn't be surprising because in the past, when the Heritage Foundation has created these sort of roadmaps for an administration, a lot of the ideas get adopted. In our podcast episode of A Matter of Degrees, which you can download anywhere, the episode's called Project 2025, I think we talk about how something like 3/4 of past roadmaps have ended up being adopted in administration. So what are some of the things that they've talked about? And I think this is also in line with some of the messaging you've been seeing around the so-called department. It's not actually a department. A department is a very technical thing that requires an act of Congress, but the Department of Government Efficiency, I think is what it is called. They're talking about eliminating parts of the government that isn't really legally allowed. Many people who are appointed in civil servant roles can't just be fired. So how exactly they plan to do that, we'll see whether or not the courts go along with it. But they've talked about, for example, in Project 2025, reducing or eliminating a bunch of the weather forecasting service. So the National Weather Service, also cutting back the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which does a lot of really important climate science. There's also been information from sort of companion documents put out with Project 2025 talking about eliminating every single climate change mention. I think the reality is, though, that the Trump administration, like other administrations, has people with different views inside of it. And not everybody is necessarily going to want to eliminate every mention of climate change or necessarily throw out all the clean energy policies that have been made. And so I think it will be interesting to see some of the tensions that arise from, for example, companies that are making money off of the clean energy transition and some of these attempts to get rid of climate policy. So I don't anticipate that it will be as clear cut as just reading Project 2025 suggests. I think that there's going to be different interests within the administration.
Right, okay. Well, you also helped to craft the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as Juliet has already said, is one of the biggest investments in tackling climate change in US history. So can you talk a little bit about what that act does? And do you think Trump will move to cancel it or change it? And what would be the repercussions if he did?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is that the Inflation Reduction Act is a law. And laws are passed by the legislative branch. And in the United States, unlike a Westminster-style system, the legislative branch and the executive branch are separate. And so Trump will control the executive branch, and I think we can expect a lot of changes and damage to things like the Environmental Protection Agency or the DOE. But when it comes to a law, they have to go through Congress. And what we're looking at for the next Congress is probably only a maybe 2-seat majority for the Republicans in the House of Representatives. Remember, you have to have 218 seats. So 2 seats is small to be the majority. 2 seats is a small amount, right? It's like 1%. So that's going to be very hard to think about how they would move any legislation, not just legislation that would potentially roll back investments. And I think the reality is, and we've already had more than a dozen Republican members of the House sign a letter before the election saying that they didn't support repealing clean energy tax credits. As Juliet talked about, Other estimates suggest that 3/4 of the funding are flowing into Republican districts. This is the Clean Economy Tracker. It's a slightly different estimate than what Juliet talked about. But no matter how you slice it, the reality is that so much of the benefits are flowing to Republican districts. And so are there going to be Republican House members who have to be elected every 2 years, right? So they've got a really intense relationship with their constituents. Are they going to want to do things that shut down factories and investments and jobs in their own backyard? That's a really fair question. And then also in the Senate, the other branch, the other part of the legislative branch, the other chamber, the Republicans are just going to have a couple seat majority. And there are several people, like, for example, newly elected Senator John Curtis from Utah, who has been convening sort of Republican climate summits. And I believe he has an electrified home. And so, I think that depolarizing climate change as a topic where we don't just have right-wing parties saying it's not real and not wanting to do something about it, we may be going through a period where that's starting to happen in the United States, and that depolarization might not be the beautiful vision in our heads of what depolarization looks like. It might be a more complex process.
Yeah, I mean, that will be very interesting to watch. Your book, Short Circuiting Policy, examines clean energy policies and tries to understand why US states are not always on track to meet climate targets. And you touch specifically in that book on the US electricity system. Could you just finally, before we move on to Ellen, talk a little bit about why it is that the electricity infrastructure in this country is not building renewable energy fast enough, and why it is that alternative technologies still seem to face such significant barriers to getting adopted?
Yeah, well, I think we are making more progress than we ever had before. So this big law that we're talking about includes tax credits to build wind and solar, and for the first time, batteries, everything from battery manufacturing to deployment. That means you can start to build what's called community microgrid, or a virtual power plant is another term for it. But basically, you can start to build solar that can be taken offline in the case of an outage or supply constraints. And there's a lot of money going into solar and all the components of it and batteries. And those are real jobs in the United States, everything from manufacturing through to deployment and components. And that is really starting to change the politics. And so when I looked at state laws, one thing I found was that electric utilities and fossil fuel companies who did not want to do the transition would often roll back laws. But that if we started to have companies and also activist groups organize effectively, that they might be able to present alternative, sort of you could have opponents to having clean energy laws, and then you could have advocates. And if those advocates could get better organized, maybe that would hold laws in place. And that is the hopeful thing that I think we're starting to see. I was actually on a call yesterday with one of the early entrepreneurs in the solar industry. He helped pass some of the first net metering laws in the United States. These are kind of like feed-in tariffs, not exactly. But anyway, I mean, when you think about the industry in like the 70s and 80s, the solar industry, it was like, he told me actually the first project that started net metering was Robin Williams, the actor, had a ranch and they wanted to put solar on the roof. And they wanted to pass a law to make that happen. And when you just think about sort of like where we've come from with the amount of people employed and how niche and sort of, hippies it was, to really big business with, millions of employees, like this is just such a change. And I think that we are starting to see that momentum, what we might call policy feedback, a sort of lock-in of policies. So I'm not as pessimistic as you might think I would be feeling right now.
Right. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the idea of green energy has become much more mainstream, it's not for other people, it's for kind of everyone now. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm. So Ellen, just coming to you now. And you occupy a different space entirely from our two speakers who've already gone, in that you are the Undersecretary for Science and Research at the Smithsonian. So you are communicating to the public that way. And that sees you working with collections and educational learning programs, sometimes for children. How can we use these kind of foundational aspects of a museum and people often see museums as kind of a repository or showcase for the past, for things that have already happened. How can we use them then to educate and influence the future? What's coming next?
Great question, and thank you for having me here today. A lot of the people don't realize the Smithsonian actually started as a scientific research institution, and we still are one. We have over 700 scientists around the world. We have the longest studied tropical rainforest in the world, down in Panama. We do work on coastal ecosystems. We do work in forests, grasslands. We return species and help breed endangered species. Some people who are coming to Washington this winter, please come see our two new pandas that we have at the National Zoo. So our over 700 scientists do a huge range of research, but we just launched an initiative about 2 years ago called Life on a Sustainable Planet. And what it's about is bringing together all the resources of the Smithsonian to really think about this question of, given climate change, given the incredible loss we're seeing in biodiversity around the world, how do we put our scientific assets towards solutions, especially where humans and nature come together? We do work in forests measuring carbon to help hopefully create a more open, verified system for validating carbon in forests, all the way to, as you say, spending a lot of time educating the public, whether it's producing curricula for kids around resilience or around explaining different aspects of how the world is changing due to our changing climate, to really making sure that visitors who come into the museums learn about what the effects of climate change are. But one of the things we've certainly realized is you have to approach people where they are, and you have to show them how climate change might affect them. Most people are probably pretty familiar with the research that says most of the public actually accepts that climate change is happening, but a lot of them don't think it will affect them. Obviously, people in North Carolina are no longer thinking that. Certainly, people around the country who've been affected by wildfires. But our job is to make sure people understand climate change is affecting all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're also at an interesting point. It's interesting that so many things are happening all at once. We're also at this time in history when public trust in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, particularly given the views of some of the new administration's appointees, is not very low, but it's lower than it has been at other points in history. How important is it then that museums and other cultural and educational institutions, and the reason I'm asking these questions, of course, is because this is a science museum hosting this conversation, how can they do their bit to increase fluency in science, trust in science? How do you achieve that? And is that even your goal, to achieve trust?
I think it is to achieve trust, because if you consider that the public uses science and technology every day, the jobs of the future are increasingly based on technology. So this is critical, not just for training the next generation of scientists, but training the public who is being affected by issues. I know we're going to get to AI later. For example, what is AI? How is it going to affect us? What is climate change? How is it affecting us? What is green energy? How can that help people's lives? What is pollution? All of these questions are things that museums around the world are addressing and trying to say, what does the public understand about science? How do we help them understand the scientific process, which is one of continual learning and improvement? And I think you saw, especially during COVID, where the scientific community was having a hard time having the public watch over our shoulders as we tried to figure something out. Science is a messy, complicated process. We have to educate the public, not just about what we learn from the scientific process, but how it works and how they can be part of it, which is why you'll see a lot of museums around the world, a lot of scientific organizations increasingly talking about participatory science. How do we get people out there counting birds in their backyard to help them really look at the world right in their backyard and understand how it's changing? We've got to link people to nature to really move towards a lot of resilient solutions. And museums have a key role to play in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just finally, I want you to go back to your previous role when you were chief scientist at NASA and just ask you a couple of questions related to that. Firstly, in what ways do you see space technology helping with climate modeling, our understanding of climate change? Does this kind of help at a predictive level? And also the other thing I very quickly wanted to ask was that we know there are members of Donald Trump's team who are interested in space travel, for instance, or even the prospect of colonizing other planets or moons very far in the future. Just, as an exercise in experimentation or a thought process, if the effects of climate change did become, let's say, absolutely devastating to the point where people had to leave the planet, is this something scientists or policymakers are even thinking about, this idea that we could inhabit other worlds instead?
No, as Carl Sagan famously said, it's that simple. As Carl Sagan famously said, the Earth is where we make our stand. There is no other place we have found in the solar system that is the only place that it's practical with any kind of technology we have for us to actually get to that is hospitable to humans. The surface of Mars is radiated. You'd have to live underground. We need to send scientists to Mars to look for whether or not life evolved on Mars, but that's my previous job, so I'm not talking about that today. But the idea of wholesale moving humanity anywhere is not practical. And why, when we have the technology, the understanding, the ability to ensure that this planet is actually habitable? This is a solvable problem. And I love that everybody here today has been talking about there are solutions out there. This is not an intractable problem. It's one that we can absolutely address, which I think is incredibly positive. And so technology and space technology are critical to this. For example, we're about to have a gallery open next year at the Air and Space Museum in Washington that's going to be talking how we used aviation and spaceflight to actually understand that climate change is happening. A lot of critical measurements for climate models are from data that we collect from Earth satellites. So space technology is helping us not just understand that climate change is happening and improving climate models, it's actually providing solutions. So at the Smithsonian, we're using satellite data to connect to our ground measurements for that carbon validation in forests. We use satellite data to track species around the world to understand how they move to help protect them. So space data is part of how we know it's happening, and it's part of what we absolutely need for the solution.
Yeah, and that Air and Space
But
Museum,
there is no other.
No.
There is no other planet to go to. I want to make that clear.
Absolutely. That's not something we can plan for right now. And yeah, I just wanted to add the Air and Space Museum is phenomenal. It is a really brilliant museum, as are all the Smithsonian museums for that matter. So I want to bring you all back together now, all three of you, for a panel discussion. And I'll be aiming these questions to specific speakers, but if any of you would like to jump in or follow up with any thoughts, please feel free, just put your hands up and I'll come straight to you. But Juliet, just starting with you then. We have seen in the impact of extreme weather events in the US, which there have been quite a few of this year, especially the recent hurricanes. In what ways can we utilize technology to predict and limit the impact of those kind of natural disasters? Because some of the stories that came out of the hurricanes this year were just devastating. What can we really do?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's challenging. I mean, one of the interesting things, I know we'll talk about this a little bit, is actually AI has been helpful in some of the forecasting. So there is that. I think that that's that is something that will only continue to expand and is something that kind of experienced meteorologists are looking at as ways to be more helpful. I will say that actually. Certainly technology can help, but honestly, part of it is awareness. One of the really interesting things that we saw with Hurricane Milton, for example, is that the governor, a Republican, Ron DeSantis, took the warnings very seriously, focused. Florida is very experienced in dealing with hurricanes. And as a result, folks mobilized, they evacuated. They also were lucky that the path of the storm ended up, for example, not delivering a devastating blow to Tampa, which is something that is a perennial concern because of the infrastructure there. But it really was actually human behavior and people responding and evacuating. And the contrast is when you look at Western North Carolina, where people were much less used to severe storms, And those warnings did come too late. There was, really not the same infrastructure to, kind of government warning infrastructure to really get people out of harm's way in time, that you saw just tragic losses. So sometimes it really is a matter of people taking this seriously, listening to scientists, listening to government officials, as well as things like, for example, we've seen fewer Americans, not more Americans, getting flood insurance. And that's something that's really important and has a huge impact on recovery. So I think, others might have thoughts about technology, but in some ways, there are actually real policy changes that probably will have the biggest impact on people's lives.
Right. And just sticking on policy a little bit, Leah, coming to you, the new administration has hinted at increased tariffs, as we know, on countries like China, as well as on imported cars. What does that mean for electrical vehicle imports, the US EV market, in turn, the impact on climate change? Could we see then a boom in US produced electric vehicles as a result of that kind of change? What do you anticipate?
Yeah, well, I would say it's more than hinted at this point. Yesterday, I believe there was reporting that Trump wants to put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which is interesting because he renegotiated the free trade agreement, NAFTA, when he was president the first time to the USMCA. And yeah, that would raise the costs of a lot of things, including, interestingly, fossil fuels, because there are various hubs in the United States that import oil, crude oil from Alberta, and they do specialized refining to make it into gasoline and push it through the networks. And it would actually be like a strange gas tax in various regions in the country were he to put those tariffs in place. So that's interesting. In terms of the EV policy, very interesting to see how that will play out. Obviously, Elon Musk has a privileged position in the incoming Trump administration, and he has spoken out to say that he doesn't really support the existing EV policy support. So this is these tax credits. That being said, the tax credits that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act were a strange compromise because of demands from Senator Manchin. So they require very specific chemistry in a battery. They require things to be manufactured in places that have a trade agreement with the United States. It's quite a complex policy in terms of how much money a given person could get for buying an EV. They also have income caps and things like that. So, and it's possible that Tesla as a company might not be interested in them because the tax credit doesn't disproportionately benefit them. Like Tesla has a huge share of the EV market in the United States, right? And probably their interest is not to have other companies, selling as many EVs as they are. My interest as an environmentalist is to have as many EVs as possible. But these are some of the kinds of idiosyncratic issues that have to do with the direct financial interests of people in the Trump administration. So I think it's too early to say how this will play out. I will say one other thing, which is that Governor Newsom of California has already said that if they get rid of the federal tax credit for EVs, that he would put forward a California-specific tax credit that would apply to all EVs except Tesla, which I think really pissed off Elon Musk. So who knows what will happen in the EV world. It is perhaps the most political. And I'll also say that the New York Times, including Coral Davenport, have done some very interesting reporting about how a bunch of these companies, these car companies, have made big investments to build EV manufacturing in the United States. And they actually want stability, not just in the tax credits, but also in the regulations for how much, the fuel standards. And they are trying to politely persuade the Trump administration to not roll back environmental policies because they've made billions of dollars of investments under the scenario that this is what the world looks like. You have to remember that these companies, right, they're putting huge amounts of money on the table, huge amounts of physical infrastructure, hiring people. They don't really like an unstable policy environment. So EVs are probably the most thorny issue, I would say, in terms of what we're going to see in the coming years.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because really, whichever policy we look at, and EVs included, we're weighing up not just the ideological or political goals of the administration as a whole, but also the personal and economic goals of individuals within that administration, friends of Donald Trump and others, which just makes it very difficult to navigate and to know exactly what's going to happen. Okay, so Ellen, coming to you, just broadening out the conversation to another set of technologies now. The term artificial intelligence was coined in the US in the 1950s. Does AI play a role in helping the modern US, the world, interpret climate change and preparing for a greener future? What part does AI play in all of this?
You know, AI can play a significant role across the spectrum. I know the group up at Columbia University in New York put out a report earlier this year looking at how AI could be applied to a whole range of things, from how do we operate the grid we have more efficiently, how do we use energy more efficiently, to, in my area of science, how do we apply it to understand and improve climate models? I mean, for example, right now, there was a time about 56 million years ago called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when the Earth rapidly heated up. We're actually at the Smithsonian looking at pollen grains from across the center of the United States. There are thousands and thousands of pollen grains that we're using artificial intelligence to identify what exactly those plants were, because then we can give a much narrower temperature and precipitation range for what was exactly happening in that region at that point in time. You can then use that to better tie climate models backwards, which allows us to improve them going forward. It's really important for us. It's important for farmers around the world to be able to now say, in 25 years, what grains are we going to be able to grow and where, with our changing climate, with the amount of climate change that we know is going to happen. So AI is going to help us with, I would say, a whole broad class of climate solutions, especially around resilience to the effects of climate change that are, so to speak, already baked in. Hate to use that kind of pun. There you go.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, we've already talked a little bit about the huge amount of innovation that's happening in order to mitigate the impact of climate change in the future, to come up with solutions. Ellen, for you, what climate-specific scientific innovations are you particularly excited about? What are you putting your faith in now? Is it solar? Is it battery storage, carbon capture? What do you think is the most exciting?
Well, I think MIT, I think I read this in the Post, or I'm not sure I read it. MIT recently came out with yet another analysis, I think, on carbon capture. And that's probably the one I have the least faith in. Again, in my mind, we have a lot of the technology solutions we need with green energy. We have a lot of the solutions we need on how to make buildings more efficient. We have EVs. You know, a lot of the technologies are out there that we already need to move forward. We just have to move forward with adopting them, which moves into the policy sphere, which I'm not a policy person. So I'm optimistic around technology, but I would argue it's much more about the implementation of what we already have than the development of new technology.
And I'd love to ask Leah, Juliet, that same question to you. What kind of technologies are you interested in, or do you feel, as Ellen does, it's more about implementation at this point? Juliet, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say that, you know, at the Washington Post, we have a vertical called Climate Solutions. And so we're constantly writing about, you know, ways people are solving these problems. And we have a series called Climate Leap that we've been running for the last several months. The last installment will be next month. And it's, you know, there's some really incredible innovations. And part of the question, of course, is how do you get it to scale and you know, what impacts? But, you know, from everything from there are researchers that are genetically re-engineering the cow's biome to make sure that it's not, that cows are not releasing as much methane. I mean, something like that actually, in terms of could really have like a huge impact on the planet, as could, you know, some of the innovators who are looking at greener cement, which of course cement, the you know, creating cement and concrete is a huge driver of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and is as so much building is happening, especially in the developing world, is something that's going to have a huge impact. So there are a lot of things. The one thing I would say on artificial intelligence that I just wanted to say is there is a flip side of that, and we're seeing the huge energy demand from AI. There are 220 gas plants right now that are in development, and the analysis from Bloomberg and EF is that AI will account for 10 to 30% of our current electricity that comes from gas plants, and you're seeing fights on the ground about should you build a new coal plant or not, a new gas plant, or should you keep a coal plant running to deal with that energy? So that is a real question. But again, if there is enough innovation,
value and benefit do they give us versus the amount of pollution? And per Juliet's point about the 220 gas plants, I want to give a shout out to the Sierra Club, which has been doing amazing analysis, including this report called The Dirty Truth, which you can just Google, which looks at all these proposed gas plants. And it's really a shifting justification for why these utilities are building these gas plants, right? AI is just the latest excuse that they have to build gas plants. When, to go to the solutions part of your question, the cheapest thing that they could be doing is building solar and batteries. So what we call a virtual power plant, which is solar, batteries, and switchgear, which is just the technology that allows you to sort of go on and off grid. That is the cheapest thing to build these days. And so where I live in Santa Barbara, California, I'm working with a solar company to try to build a giant virtual power plant in my own community, because we're particularly vulnerable to power outages because of where we're located, things like fires and mudslides and stuff like that. So I'm very excited about solar as a technology. It has come so far, as I've mentioned. The cost declines have just been massive. And now that we have the same kinds of cost declines playing out in batteries as well as switchgear, we can really deploy it in a new way. So my own home right now, I believe this call is powered on solar, and I have a battery and switchgear, and so I can use it even when the sun goes down. So these are the kinds of technologies that I think will really make a big dent. And I'm also really excited about electrification. And this is something that everyday people can do. I like to say that you might be running a fossil fuel power plant and not know it. That's called your home, whether you're in an apartment or a house. And if you've got a gas furnace and you've got a gas water heater or any kind of other fossil fuel machine in your home, that's like a little mini fossil fuel power plant. And so one thing that I did was I electrified my home. I put in a heat pump water heater, a heat pump HVAC. I have an induction stove. I no longer have a gas bill. I do not pay money to the gas company anymore. And you can also do that with your car. You can get an electric vehicle or an e-bike. I know people are very excited about e-bikes. I have several of them. My kids right now are off at the library in an e-bike. So, the future is now. And there are so many cool things that we can do. Some of these things might take a little bit of time. Maybe you just do your water tank first, and then you turn it into a heat pump, and then a few years later you do your furnace. Or if you live in an apartment or a condo or something like that, you join with your neighbors to make that decision together. But these are things that we can and have to change, right? The infrastructure is not just giant fossil fuel power plants. It's also our own homes. And so there's so much that everyday people can do to make a difference on climate change.
I mean, that's inspirational. Amazing that you're doing all that work in your own home and your own life. Ellen, then just coming back to you with regards to what Juliet and Leah have already said, a lot of scientific innovation relies on new technologies like AI, but they also consume huge amounts of energy. How do scientists then balance that, knowing that they want to do things with AI, but knowing how wasteful it can be in terms of energy consumption?
Well, I think this goes back to the issue is how are we producing energy and where are we producing energy? There are ways to use renewable power to produce the power that we might need for data centers, for example. But we're not necessarily doing that right now. And so there are solutions out there. It depends on the pressure the public puts on companies who are building more and more data centers that take up huge amounts of energy. For those of us in the Washington, D.C. area, you can't drive down a freeway these days without seeing a new data center being put up. And it's really concerning because a lot of these are not using renewable energy. And so this push for more and more data, and I would argue we're all guilty because most of us have one of these. And, I got pictures of my grandkids, my dogs, my kids, and all of this is data, which is, we're part of the problem. So thinking about what the solution is and then making sure that we're all advocating for those solutions, I think is critically important. And we do worry about it as scientists to say, how much are we relying on these new technologies like AI? And we use them, but we try to use them sparingly and where they are really needed to give us the solutions we need around resilience for life on this planet.
Absolutely. And Leah, I just want to come back to you on this, this question of progress on climate being not just a technological problem, because I think we all almost imagine that if only a technological fix would come along, somehow this would all go away, that it would all disappear overnight. But there, everything is mediated by politics, by what the public is able to do or accept. And we did see a lot of we see them increasingly around lots of areas of politics, but fake claims, for example, about the recent hurricanes and their origins spreading online. You've written particularly about the US electrical utility industry's role in promoting climate denial and doubt. How grave is the threat of that information ecosystem that we're in, in which people can get completely different worldviews depending on the information they're reading or they're consuming? And how does that also stymie research and investment into alternatives, block pathways to political progress around this?
Yeah, I think in the wake of the election in the United States, there's been a lot of focus in how people get information. And just a small thing that I think is interesting, or maybe it's not a small thing, is social media, right? Whether we're talking about Twitter, now X, or Threads, the new Instagram text-based platform, these algorithms, the companies have made specific decisions to keep people within the ecosystem and to downweight posts that have links to the Washington Post or the Boston Globe or the Guardian. And so people are not really exiting these ecosystems and going into fact-based sources, like all the stuff that Juliet spends her life trying to, really get correct. And it's been very interesting to watch in the wake of the election, this new platform called Blue Sky grow. Because one thing that people are noticing who are editors at various magazines and newspapers is that the traffic from these sites is a lot higher because Blue Sky does not have an algorithm in the same way that is downweighting links. And so it is actually pushing people out into fact-based information, whether that's an academic article or a newspaper article. But when you have these social media sites that make money from grabbing our attention and not letting it go, and that makes us feel kind of crappy as people too. You look at some of I don't know if you've seen these studies that young people say that they would pay money for Instagram to no longer exist, right? The way that these ecosystems are operating, whether we're talking about TikTok or Instagram or X or things like that, is they're keeping people in the ecosystem and they're not moderating, information. They're not doing fact checking. Of course they aren't. And so I think it's a really hopeful thing that we're starting to see alternatives like Blue Sky grow that are about pushing people back into information that is accurate and vetted. I don't think that's a panacea by any means, but people are really starting to have hard conversations about how we build ecosystems, across the political spectrum that are fact-based and really invest in that.
You've already mentioned this, the fact that you see polarization, the very deep polarization that we have seen in American politics lately and in everyday discourse, starting to break down a little bit. Can you just expand on that? Where do you see that happening and why is it happening? Is it because people are migrating to different kinds of social media, or have they just reached a breaking point and now they think things have to change? What is going on here?
Yeah. So my analysis, as well as other political scientists, about how we got to this moment where right-wing parties in the United States, but in many other countries, oppose climate action, spread climate disinformation, saying it's a hoax or it's not real, et cetera. How did we get to that place? People might think back not that far and know that there were senators, for example, like John McCain, who ran for president, who believed in climate change, who championed some policies on it. And yet now we're in a moment where it feels like, where are these Republicans who want to act? Well, I think a big part of why that happened is fossil fuel and electric utility money in politics. So when you have fossil fuel companies putting enormous amounts of money into the Republican Party, including into primaries. So, for example, this congressman from South Carolina named Bob Inglis, he was a Republican in Congress, and he initially didn't really believe in climate change like all the other Republicans, but he went on a trip. Well, no, first his son went to him, and his son said, like, hey, Dad, climate change is real and I'm worried for my generation. And you see this, younger Republicans care and worry about climate change. So that was the first thing that happened. And then he went on a trip, I think, with Congress. Maybe it was to Greenland, and he saw ice melting directly and saw climate change with his own eyes, and it changed him. But what happened was, when he started to talk about climate change, he got challenged in a primary. So he lost his seat to another Republican. And that is what happens when you have so much money in politics and the only interest groups playing in the game are fossil fuel interest groups. This very interesting moment we find ourselves in today is that suddenly the clean economy is here. There are people making a lot of money, such as Elon Musk, from things like electrification and solar power and batteries. And so we're going to start to see some of those companies challenge the fossil fuel companies within the Republican coalition. And that might not be how people want things to be depolarized, because they don't think there should be money in politics, et cetera. Very fair. But I think that's what we're starting to see, is that when there are interest groups on the other side of the issue, that can start to change the position of politicians around the world.
Yeah, and that's happening in, as you are saying, in quite a paradoxical way then, that you could achieve the outcome that, let's say, people on the democratic progressive left might want, but done through a very different mechanism than you would have expected. That's fascinating. Juliet, just coming back to you, with regards to this administration coming in next year, there are indications that they will pull out of the Paris Agreement. Is there anything that could be done until then, under the current administration, to safeguard climate policy? Or are you not so worried about that? Do you think that it will be okay?
Well, I'm going to give a very quick answer, and then I actually wanted to follow up on this question of polarization.
Yeah.
My quick answer is no. There's nothing that's substantively going to change. Again, I don't weigh in on opinions of whether it's good or bad. But I would say that there's nothing substantive that that this administration would do that would affect it. I think there are also, certainly, and we and others have reported about, some of the real challenges of global cooperation and action through the UN process. So that is a whole question which we get into. I did want to say on polarization, and absolutely, Leah makes a lot of really good points about, and I should also correct myself that I just was misspoke, that it's more than 3/4 of the money. That's also with the MIT analysis and rhodium analysis. Of the 3/4 of the money went to what we looked at is particularly districts that actually Trump won back in 2020 compared to Biden, and 3 times as much money has gone into these congressional districts that had a plurality of voters that voted for Trump. And I do think that obviously has a huge impact on that question. However, I do think that there are other broader trends that have contributed to polarization that are apart from campaign finance contributions that have made a real impact. My first book, Fight Club Politics, How Partisanship is Poisoning the House of Representatives, was about how redistricting, as well as kind of money controlled by actually the political parties themselves, really made the real game the political primary, which is part of what does happen to someone like Bob Inglis, that it doesn't really, in South Carolina, it's not like there are a ton of contested seats. And if you can't convince your own base voters, you're not going to end up going to Washington. So as a result, you really had a huge shift of congressional members who went to the left, congressional members who went to the right. And as a result, there was very little middle ground, which has made action on this and many other issues much more challenging. The Inflation Reduction Act passed without a single Republican vote in either chamber. So I do think that coupled with also this really interesting phenomenon that more people are moving to communities where people are like-minded voters themselves, apart from what the political parties have done, all of that has contributed to political polarization, which, could be mitigated by some of these issues, but certainly will be with us for some time, no matter what.
But do you think it's possible on issue-based things for people to not necessarily vote as a Republican bloc or as a Democratic bloc? And I'm thinking here about the abortion votes. And even in Republican-leaning seats, you had people voting for abortion measures in certain states. Could the same happen with climate change? If people en masse became so concerned about it, could it become a non-partisan issue?
Yes, certainly that possibility exists, and certainly one thing we've seen is the idea that among the younger generation, this is a less polarized issue. And one of the questions is, will there be some shift that happens because of that? And also, does it become a higher priority for voters? One of the really interesting things is, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, when you do polling, is actually it's relatively popular compared to what you might think. But those issues, including climate change, simply have not ranked high enough to be the kind of single issue that many voters cast their ballots on the way that they do sometimes on abortion or gun rights or other issues, but certainly the economy and healthcare have consistently outranked these other issues. So could there be a shift in the political landscape? Absolutely, that could happen.
Okay, that's interesting. So I want to end this part of the discussion, at least on a positive note. And Leah, in 2020, I just want to give a plug here to a book that you contributed to, All We Can Save, a collection of stories, poems, and art from women at the forefront of the climate crisis movement. You have a copy there. Okay, lovely, thank you.
There we go. There's another cool one too. Another cool one called Not Too Late that Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young-Lutinoto edited, which is also cool.
That's lovely. Yeah. That's beautiful. And, this book, All We Can Save, is a profoundly hopeful book, as well as this kind of call to action. What are you hopeful about at the moment? Tell us.
Yeah, so the All We Can Save book is cool, and it's become a sort of nonprofit that Catherine Wilkinson runs, and we make our podcast together, Catherine and I, A Matter of Degrees. So if people are interested in these kinds of hopeful stories and things like that, I just recommend people checking out our podcast, A Matter of Degrees. So yeah, it's a really beautiful collection. It has poetry and drawings and writing by lots of diverse people, women from across the movement. And yeah, I feel hopeful, honestly, in this moment. Obviously, the election in some ways was upsetting. And I think particularly on other issues like immigration, it's pretty devastating. But when it comes to climate action, I feel like we now have a test ahead of us. If our theory that if we could get interest groups built on the side of climate action, that would hold back rollbacks. Now we get to test that theory and see if it's going to hold or not, which the scientific part of me feels kind of curious and interested to see if that's going to happen or not. If, as Juliet was talking about, all this funding flowing to Republican districts is going to change the politics. And, we do have to change the politics of climate change so that all parties support action, because if we have governments change, which in democracies you do, we can't have a sort of, rolling back constantly. So it will be interesting to see what plays out in the coming years. I think there will be definitely some losses, particularly in the executive branch with things like regulations, but maybe some of these tax credits will be pretty resilient. And yeah, I'm very inspired by everyday people who are taking up this idea of what can I do in my daily life. And we have some episodes of our podcast called What Can I Do? It's a 3-part series if people want to check that out. But doing things like electrifying their home, electrifying their transportation, putting solar on their roof, working in their community to get solar on the roofs of, community buildings or other things. Like we have so many of the technologies we need, and what we really need is everyday people to deploy them. And that isn't totally dependent on what happens in Washington, D.C. If you put a heat pump water heater in your house, Donald Trump cannot take it out. So, I think that lots of things that everyday people can do to change infrastructure. That's what I'm really focused on. Where is the fossil fuel infrastructure that you control or that your community controls that you can change to electric infrastructure? Where is the places that you can build solar and batteries in your community? These are the kinds of infrastructure changes that are really structural changes, right? Infrastructure that outlive all of us. If I were to die tomorrow, my house would be electric for whoever was to live in it after me, right? And we have to do that across the board. There's 220 million cars in the United States. So we need those to be electric. And you can say more public transportation, more bikes. Yay, I'm with you. But, everyday people going and getting an EV is a really big step in the right direction.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
I'd just like
yeah,
to add
Ellen.
to that. I think what she's saying is really critical. And what's more important is that we know that when people hear these stories of how they can have a positive impact, that it actually leads them to action. If they think there's no hope, if they think there are no solutions, they will do nothing. But if you say, look, there's solutions you can actually do, and I think this is particularly important for a lot of young people who have actually, reported negative mental health because they're so concerned about the future that they perceive they're inheriting. And yet, if you show them there are solutions that they can participate in, they actually do take action. And so I think there's so much encouraging out there. We just have to get the message out.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we have a few questions from the audience that I very quickly want to put to you. I've got them here written down. So Adam asks, and any of you can take this, you just decide between you. Adam asks, how does the natural environment and biodiversity factor into the government's assessments of industry policy instruments to quantify natural capital and nature positive developments? So I think what he's saying is, does the idea of having to protect the natural environment and biodiversity also come under the climate change rubric here?
This is something that the US government has been working on for years. We've done a national climate assessment that's mandated by Congress. It comes out, one of them just came out recently. The Biden administration actually just started on something called the National Nature Assessment. So going beyond just thinking about climate change and looking at, what is the state of nature, so much, much broader across the US. And again, this is important not just because we love nature and we love charismatic megafauna, but because we know that healthy farms need pollinators. We know that healthy fisheries need coral reefs, they need seagrass, they need mangroves. So a healthy environment leads to places where people can actually make a living. And so the government has been actively thinking about the fact of how do we start looking at the value of nature and how do we factor that in, because we know it's critically important for feeding the world, for example.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. And Danielle in Chingford asks, and this is a question very close to my heart because when I still lived in the UK, I travelled everywhere by train, and I'm very disappointed I can't do that so much in the US now. But she says, transportation makes up nearly a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Why has the country fallen so far behind other developed countries with its public transport infrastructure? And is there any realistic prospect of it improving? I mean, this is a country that is built around the car. We can see that. Is there any way of making a dent in that and creating a better bus and train infrastructure? Juliet, what are your thoughts on that?
There has been significant, investment through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed with some support from Republicans, and of course, a ton of that money went towards roads. But there has been a significant amount of it that there have been opportunities. We wrote a story. Sarah Raza on our staff wrote a story about Houston and the whole debate over to what extent can Houston, which which is a city, focused on cars, to what extent can public transportation be an option there? To what extent can you have bike lanes? And we are really seeing it. There are some really hard choices and vibrant debates that are going on in communities in the United States now, but that was one of the most significant steps. And again, that is money that communities, regardless of their political orientation, often welcome, I'd say.
And what
Yeah,
about trains? Do you think
shout
there's
out
any?
to Juliet knowing about bipartisan infrastructure law. It was the largest investment in public transit in American history. Unfortunately, that was also digging a lot of public transit agencies out of a hole, because the pandemic was really hard on public transit, right? People weren't taking public transit. The ridership went down, the revenues went down. So unfortunately, it was kind of like already a problem because of the pandemic. And although that was the biggest investment ever, there's a lot to do. For example, the fight over congestion pricing in New York State is a fight about public transit, because the idea is, I think you have this already in London, but you can't go into New York City unless you pay a toll. It was going to be higher. Hochul paused it, the governor of New York. Now she's putting it back in place, and it'll be at a lower level. I think it's $9. And that will bring in a bunch of revenue that will go to the New York subway. So there is some effort to do this. I also want to say that something that really needs to be done, totally on people's radar, very expensive to do, is electrifying part of our train system. So although the north part of the United States is electric, you get on the Amtrak and you ride from Boston to New York or DC, it's electric. But once you go into the Southeast, it actually switches to diesel. It's never been electrified. It's extremely expensive to electrify. Also, it has huge benefits to all those communities, right? Because when you have a diesel train by a community, that is putting out all kinds of particulate matter and other kinds of pollutants. So there is more to be done. People like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been very passionate about this issue of investing in trains and public transit. And I think Juliet also raises a great point about bike infrastructure. I've been a cyclist for a long time. And in Santa Barbara, where I live during the pandemic, as you've seen in places like Paris and other countries, they shut down the main street so that they could have more dining outdoors and have more biking. And although there's been a conflict in the community over keeping it shut down, so far, that whole street is now a pedestrian zone. And I think people are starting to reimagine urban spaces for people and not just for cars. And that is very exciting.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And so we have one last question, and this is a very broad one. Caitlin in Rome asks, what are the impacts of the US military activity around the world on climate change? Is there any drive to decarbonize the US defense sector? And might Trump's America First policy actually lead to a reduction in emissions there? That's a very interesting question. Any thoughts on that?
I want to give a shout out to someone named Sherry Goodman, who just published a book called Threat Multiplier. She has been working to decarbonize the US military for much of her career. And it's a story about some of the progress that's been made and some of the, additional goals. She helped coin that term of a threat multiplier, the idea that climate change takes existing threats around the world and makes them even bigger. And there's been actually very interesting work done at US military bases to build, for example, solar microgrids. So if people are interested in understanding the US military, it is a giant institution. And it has the potential to drive innovation. That's certainly been the history of the military, that certain technologies have come out of the military. And now there's the potential that they could decarbonize. So I'm not speaking as much to the war parts of it and people's idea that would reduce pollution, but I just want to point to Sherry Goodman's work to try to decarbonize the military.
That's a very good link. Thank you. And I feel like that's a whole extra hour's conversation that we could be having on that topic. So we'll move on. Just a final thoughts. We're almost at the end of our discussion this evening, and I just want to get a kind of final conclusive idea from each of you in 1 minute or less, which I know is a horrible thing to say because how do you measure that? But I just want to ask you all one question. Can America still lead the way in a global green energy transition? Leah, if you'd like to go first.
I think yes. it's going to be tricky, and we're going to see what happens. But keep in mind, the U.S. political system has very short cycles. So in just 2 years from now, there will be midterms. And what we see in political science is thermostatic thermostatic politics, meaning when you don't like the president, what they're doing, it tends to swing the other way. This is what happened in 2018 when people like Green New Deal champion Representative AOC was elected. So I think that there's a lot of potential, and I'm not as pessimistic as maybe others are.
Wonderful, thank you, Juliet.
I would say that I'm rather, one way of answering that question is we published a piece today by Shannon Osaka, Maxine Joslow, and Sarah Kaplan about this new climate era that we've entered into now, nearly a decade after the Paris Climate Agreement. And I would argue that market forces and other factors may play more of a role in answering the question that you're asking than who is sitting in the White House. And so I would say that certainly that question is unanswered, I do think we're actually at a really interesting inflection point where you'll see clean energy expand, not at the rate to displace fossil fuels, and how that kind of back and forth plays out will be determined by a number of things, including the market.
Thanks so much, Juliet. That's fascinating. And Ellen, just ending with you then.
Yeah, I'd really echo that. I think the private sector matters. I think what they're doing and their choices, and they're showing they're moving more, bottom line, preparing for the future means you're going to be more profitable and a better company. And right now we know the future is going to be reduced use of fossil fuels, decarbonization, and dealing with the effects of climate change that are already going to happen. And I think the corporate world sees this. And I am optimistic that progress is going to continue, and that scientists around the world are going to keep working together to try to find the best climate resilient solutions that we can.
Okay, that's pretty hopeful, I think, from all of you, at least partly positive. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic hearing from all three of you, and we could have talked for much, much longer, and there were so many different tangents we could have gone in. Thank you for joining us, and also thank you to all of you at home for tuning in. The Science Museum Climate Talk series continues in the new year. The next talk is on the 28th of January, titled China's Road to Net Zero. You can book your free ticket by visiting the Climate Talk page via the Science Museum Group's website. And if you go there, you can also check out all the previous Climate Talks in the series. If you'd like to support the Science Museum Group across all 5 of its museums in the UK, which are all free to visit, and support their mission to inspire the next generation of scientists, engineers, mathematicians, medics, science journalists like me, then you can find a link to make a donation in the description below. And it just leaves me to thank our speakers, Leah Stokes, Juliet Eilperin, and Ellen Stofan. Thank you so much. It's just been wonderful hearing from you, and to have your expertise is just fantastic. And a huge thanks again for all of you for joining us this evening. Happy Thanksgiving and good night.